Hello, welcome to session 33 of the CEBRA Inflation Drivers and Dynamics webinar series. My name is Dominic Smith, and I am one of the organizers of this webinar series on behalf of the Central Bank Research Association. Raphael Schunle is the other co-organizer. Without much ado, let me pass the virtual stage to Damjan Pfajfar, Vice President in the Research Department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, who will be today's moderator.
Thank you, Dominic. The topics of today's sessions are minority inflation, unemployment, and monetary policy, and disentangling monetary policy, central bank information, and Fed response to news shocks. Special thanks to the organizer, Raphael Schunle from the Brandeis University and CEBRA, and Dominic Smith from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Let me introduce the formats of the webinar. The webinar is 45 minutes in total, with two presentations of approximately 15 minutes each. And then we will have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. Attendees do not have the option to switch on their audio or video, but are invited to write comments or questions in the Q&A space. Attendees can, of course, pose their questions during the presentations already and don't have to wait until the end to do so. The moderator will then select questions to be answered in the Q&A portion of the webinar, which is after presentations. The webinar is also live streamed via the CEBRA YouTube channel, recorded and made available on the CEBRA website and CEBRA YouTube channel after the event. Before we start, I have to say the disclaimer. Participation in a CEBRA webinar does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during a CEBRA or CEBRA co-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussants, and other participants, and not those of CEBRA, the co-sponsoring institutions, or any other participating institution. Let me introduce the speakers. The first speaker today will be Munseob, who is an assistant professor of economics at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategies. He will be presenting minority inflation, unemployment, and monetary policy. And the second presenter will be Marek Jarocinski, who's an economist at the ECB, and he will be talking about disentangling monetary policy, central bank information, and Fed response to news shock. Munseob, you have 15 minutes.
All right, thanks Damjan for the introduction, and thanks Dominic and Raphael for organizing this great event. So I'm going to present the joint work with Claudia Macaluso and Felipe de Schwartzman at the Federal Reserve, the Bank of the Richmond, so the usual disclaimer applies. And here I'm going to talk about the minority inflation, unemployment, and monetary policy. So to be specific, when I say the minority, so we are thinking about the difference between the black household and the white household in the United States. Let me begin with the one simple fact, the fact about the unemployment rate between these two groups over the past several decades. The line on the top is the unemployment rate of the black workers, which is pretty much twice larger than the unemployment rate of the white workers. And this massive and the persistent difference is not explained by the observable difference between these two groups, say the education, occupation, and etc. So in the paper, we construct the so-called counterfactual white, making the white having the workers having the same observable characteristics of the black, but that doesn't really explain the significant portion of the gap. Okay, so there has been the massive, the research and the policies, the best addressing the economic disparities between the Black and white Americans. But then the question we are asking in this specific paper is very simple. What can the monetary policy do? Why do we ask this question? Because we see the policy, the discussions about addressing the economic disparities, beyond the race, through the monetary policy. So, for example, the Federal Reserve Racial and Economic Equity Act proposed in Congress in 2022 explicitly state that the Fed should exercise all the duties and functions in a manner that foster the elimination of disparities across the racial and ethnic groups with respect to employment, income, wealth, and access to affordable credit. So what we're going to do today is we want to measure the differential impact of alternative monetary policy strategies on the different racial groups, focusing on the Black workers and the white workers in the United States. So we investigate whether monetary policy is an effective tool to reducing the racial disparities in real income volatility. So the monetary policy can change many things in the real world. And then we decided to focus on the one specific, the moment of our interest, which is how that affect the real income volatility. So I will explain later why we chose this specific moments, but please keep in mind that that's the moment of our interest. Let me briefly tell you what we found. We found that the Black families experience the higher real income volatility, and that is driven by the greater volatility both in unemployment and the price. And thinking about the monetary policy, making the balance or facing the trade-off between the unemployment volatility and the price volatility, so the relative benefit of the certain stance of the monetary policy becomes ambiguous. So if you want to address the volatility in the unemployment rate, that may increase the volatility in the price. So then qualitatively, whether the accommodative monetary policy will be beneficial toward the Black households compared to the white household is ex ante ambiguous. So we are going to show you some quantification, the result, and then with the sufficient statistics, so under the new Keynesian model. So we are going to argue that the accommodative monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy, particularly benefits the low income, the Black household in the case of the cost push shock, because they face the higher the unemployment rate, but it harms the high income household of any race, facing the higher price volatility. So it will be clear later, but keep in mind the tension between the unemployment volatility and then the price volatility. Now let me formally define what I really mean by the real income volatility, which we write as Y. It's the function of the three observable the data moments. The W is the nominal wage divided by the price index, which is the real wage, and then we are going to adjust that by the employment rate, the one minus the unemployment rate. And we can get the wage, price, and unemployment rate from the CPS, CES, and the BLS data, taking into account the difference in the labor market outcome and then the difference in the consumption basket between these two groups. And here is our result. So I'm reporting the standard deviation of the real income. So I just want to focus on the first column, reporting the real income for the 4 different groups. So we have Black and white, and then they are divided by their income level. So the low income versus the high income, using the median income as a cutoff. Just looking at the real income, the Black households are facing the 35% higher volatility, and within the higher income household, the Black families are facing the 96% higher the real income volatility. And we report the ratio between these two racial groups within the income group in the last 2 rows. And those are mostly driven by the volatility in unemployment and volatility in the prices. Interestingly, for the prices, if you look at the ratio, the CPI, the last column of the table, the difference is not there for the lower income households, but we see that the Black households are facing the higher price volatility among the higher income households. Okay, this is the fact. This is what we find from the US data looking at the past 3 decades. But then the natural question is why? I mean, why do we see this the racial disparity in real income volatility? So the higher volatility in the Black employment stems from its overall higher level. And as I said in the first slide, the observable characteristics explain the little of this the racial disparity. So there is some deep structural reasons, the driving the fundamental difference in the labor market outcome between the white and then the Black, the workers. And this is something the monetary policy cannot directly address. The structure, the fundamental difference is there, but still what we can do is the taking into account the fundamental differences in the level and in the volatility. So we're going to take that as exogenously given in our framework. But then now thinking about the price volatility, given that it is disproportionately driven by the higher income Black household, we can see what they are spending differently compared to the similar income level in the white household. And we think this is related to the big related goods and the services, including the gasolines. And there has been the discussions about the visible goods, and then the Black households are living the far from the city center, so they have to commute. So those could be the potential reasons behind the difference in the consumption basket between the Black and the white household among the higher income household. But we are going to also take this as given when we evaluate the effectiveness of the monetary policy. Now let me tell you about the framework to evaluate the different scenarios of the monetary policy. So we are going to use the new Keynesian model, but we are going to do the simplification because we want to use the sufficient statistics approach. So our simplification is reducing this to only to 2 periods, and then there is no borrowing then savings. So we ignore any wealth channels. And then the real income volatility can be directly translated into the real consumption volatility, which is important evaluating the welfare. So the consumers want to avoid the increase in the real income volatility in this setup intuitively. So let's consider a cost push shock, increasing both unemployment rate and inflation, and then the central bank face the trade-off. Okay, so whether we want to conduct the less or more accommodative the monetary policy. And we are interested in how that is translated into the volatility in the real income. So imagine that if the central bank conduct the accommodative monetary policy, the addressing the unemployment, reducing the unemployment, the rate, the volatility, and how that is going to be transmitted into the decrease in improvement in the real income volatility. So you can interpret this equation as the gains, net gains of the accommodative monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy. And that comes from the 2 channels. The first channel is the unemployment channel, and second channel is the price channel. So accommodative monetary policy is going to reduce the unemployment rate. So the unemployment channel is the larger if the specific group faces the higher unemployment rate compared to the national average. The price channel comes from the difference between the 2 coefficients of the Phillips curve. The psi p is the Phillips curve coefficient, the price Phillips curve the coefficient, and psi w is the wage Phillips curve the coefficient. So the meaning that which one is reacting the faster, comparing the price and the nominal wage, indicating how the real wage changes when the unemployment rate changes. So we're going to calculate those for each group, and then we want to tell you quantitatively whether the accommodative monetary policy is benefiting the specific group. But then we have to deal with the challenging job, which is estimating the Phillips curve, the coefficient for the 4 different groups divided by the race and the income. So we are taking the one specific approach here, but I mean we are now in the stage of the checking the robustness of our wizard using the other type of the instrument. But the Phillips curve is very simple. It's the relationship between the 12 months inflation on the left-hand side and then unemployment rate the 12 the month ago. Controlling for the demographic characteristics, the seasonal controls, and then the oil shocks. So for now, we are using the dummy for the post-Lehman period as an instrument, interpreting that the spike in the unemployment rate and then its slower recovery was more coming from the demand shock. And then that happened during the lower bound period. And then next slide, I will show you the Phillips curve coefficient on wage and on price. And this is our result. This is the price Phillips curve comparing the 4 income groups. So I want you to, not income group, the 4 different groups. Comparing the white and black within the low income group, there's no significant difference. But looking at the high income white versus black, we see that the black household face the significantly the steeper the price Phillips curve. And then we didn't find much difference between these two, the racial groups within the same income group in the wage Phillips curve, the slopes. But now we have all the moments. Let me quickly remind you what sufficient statistics approach we had. Now we have a slope of the Phillips curve and we know the overall the unemployment rate. Then we can calculate the gains of the accommodative monetary policy in the case of the cost push shock. And this is the final slide. So we report the total effect of accommodative monetary policy that is on net benefiting the low-income household, more so on the black household, and then it is on net hurting the high-income household, but that is coming from the gains from the unemployment channel and the loss from the price channel. So one last message I want to convey is that the targeting the specific racial group may not be the good idea, because we have to take into account any the socioeconomic the disparities within the racial group. I mean, to the better address the disparity between the race, because ignoring these income differences, the monetary policy only thinking about the average difference between these two racial groups could yield the unintended the consequences. So that's basically what I say in the conclusion. So yeah, I will stop here and then looking forward to talking further over the Q&A session. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Munseob, and thank you for being on time. Marek, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So let me share. Do you see the slides? Okay. Okay, so this is joint work with Peter Karady. We are both at the ECB. The views are, of course, our own and not those of the ECB. It's about disentangling central bank information for response to news and monetary policy shocks. So as motivation, so we are interested in finding exogenous and measuring exogenous variation in monetary policy or monetary policy shocks, because that's indispensable if you want to do any econometrics, right? If monetary policy is perfectly endogenous, perfectly follows the rule, we can still use structural models to study its effectiveness. But if we want to cross-check that with some econometric work, we need some exogenous variation in policy, right? To run a VDR or to run local projections. And the large literature uses high-frequency surprises around FOMC announcements to proxy for such exogenous variation in policy. This is a good approach under the assumption that the market incorporates all available information about the state of the economy and about the policy role. And therefore, market is able to price in the endogenous policy. And then markets will only be surprised by an announcement to the extent that it revealed some exogenous variation in policy. Now, this is a fairly old approach. It has about 25 years now, but recent literature raises concerns about it. First, the first concern is that these high-frequency surprises measured in a narrow window around the Fed announcements, that they're contaminated by endogenous policy. This can come either through the central bank information effect, which was raised already back in 2000 by Roman Romer, or by the more recently proposed Fed response to news effect proposed in recent works by Bauer and Swanson. The second problem is that there are only 8 FOMC meetings per year, and then Rami in her review paper highlights that this leads to low instrument relevance, right? So this instrument just doesn't vary very much. And then we can use sign restrictions to identify these different effects, but that only leads to set identification and therefore very low precision. So in this paper, we will disentangle 3 shocks out of these high-frequency market surprises around Fed announcements: a monetary policy shock, a Fed response to news shock, and a central bank information shock. We will distinguish between these shocks by essentially following the literature. We will extend the data set to include more Fed events, like speeches, press conferences, etc., following this recent work by Swanson and Jayavikrama. And instead of using sign restrictions, we will mainly use heteroscedasticity based identification, which is due to the seminal paper by Rigoban in 2003. And we will find a strong response to monetary policy shocks purged of endogeneity bias. We'll find the relevant central bank information shocks and a smaller role for the Fed response to news shocks. So now, if this sounds a bit mysterious, I hope to clarify it in the next slide. So this is the one slide that contains all of our theoretical framework. So that's a key slide. And as you see, it's very simple. So we think that the Fed's policy rule is to set its interest rate I as a function of the state of the economy X. And the coefficient is alpha, right? And alpha F denotes the variables, the Fed, right, variables. And epsilon is an occasional deviation from the systematic policy, so a monetary policy shock. Markets understand that the Fed follows such a policy rule, right? But their beliefs are denoted by M. So they believe the state of the economy is XM, and they believe that the coefficient in the policy rule is alpha M. Now, an announcement comes, right? So markets form their expectations prior to the announcement, but then Fed announces, says something about the policy, about its policy rates, and markets, may or may not be surprised. But if they're surprised, that may be well. So then, to see why they're surprised, we just have to subtract the second equation from the first equation. And rearranging terms, we obtain this simple expression, right? So markets going from right to left will be surprised by, obviously, by the exogenous policy shock, but they can also be surprised by endogenous monetary policy, either because they misperceive the coefficient, the Fed reaction coefficient, or because they misperceive the state of the economy. Right? If everybody agrees, so if XF is equal to XM and alpha F is equal to XM, so if everybody agrees about the policy rule coefficient, about the state of the economy, then we're in this perfect world. And assumed in the papers by Kuttner, 2001, Bernanke and Kuttner, Girdler, Karadi, right? Then everything is perfect. But in a more imperfect world where the beliefs about these quantities may differ, we can have these additional complications, right? And different views about the state of the economy that gives rise to the central bank information effect while misperceptions of the Fed reaction function lead to this Fed response to news effect highlighted by Bauer and Swanson. So what I want to stress is that markets may be surprised, not just because of monetary policy shocks, but also because of endogenous monetary policy. And if we take that as an instrument, then that will be contaminated by an endogeneity bias. Okay, so the lessons from this simple framework are these, right? That monetary policy surprises, that is measured financial market surprises, can be contaminated by endogenous policy, either as a central bank information or as a Fed response to news. They generate, since they capture endogenous monetary policy response, right? The shock is an economic shock to which the Fed responds. So they will generate similar attenuation bias in monthly VERs and local projections. As stressed in our earlier work with Peter, central bank information triggers a positive high-frequency co-movement between interest rate and stock prices, while the Fed response to news effect as monetary policy shocks trigger a negative co-movement. And then Bauer and Swanson stress that this policy rule misperception implies predictability of monetary policy surprises. And we will take all these insights now to the data. So the first thing we do is extend the data set, right? So we will have, our data goes from 88 to 2024, and we will have FOMC announcements and all these types of non-FOMC events. And then we will have 3 samples. So one sample will be all FOMC announcements. Another sample will be all big non-FOMC events, because many of these non-FOMC events are actually quite boring and quite unremarkable. And the baseline sample will combine both of them, and that will be about 700 observations. The first step is we run these predictability regressions by Bauer and Swanson. So we regress the monetary policy surprises measured in narrow windows around all these 700 events on a bunch of variables that are used in various papers that apply this approach. And we obtain from this regression a fitted value and a residual. Right, so I will just flip through this regression. It contains many variables because we want to be conservative, so we want to put as many as possible. And let me just zoom in on the bottom of the table. So we can see here that the R squared, the R squared of this regression, of this predictability regressions, are much higher on the FOMC subsample than on the non-FOMC subsample, right? So this predictability manifests this, right, which is related to the misperception of the Fed policy function. It manifests itself mainly in this subsample of FOMC events and not so much in the subsample of the remaining, of the non-FOMC events, like speeches, press conferences, etc. So that's great for identification because we have 2 groups of events where with different mixes of shocks. One thing is what I've just highlighted, and then there is also another difference between FOMC and non-FOMC events. And that's here in the scatter plots at the bottom, where you see that the co-movement between interest rate and stock price surprises is more negative on the FOMC subsample and is less negative, is just weaker on the non-FOMC subsample. So this suggests again that the CBI shocks, the information shocks, are more frequent or more bigger in this non-FOMC subsample. So that's great. We have different mixes of shocks, so we can estimate, so we can identify shocks thanks to this heteroscedasticity. So we estimate such a model where our observable data are the interest rate surprises, their residuals and the fitted values from the predictability regressions, and S&P 500 surprises over these around 700 events. We think of them as generated by 3 orthogonal shocks, and the shocks have different standard deviations on FOMC and non-FOMC events, and therefore we can estimate the shocks and their impact thanks to this insight of Rico Bond. We do it in a Bayesian way. So yeah, we have some simulations and Markov chain simulations. So I wanted to just say that the standard deviations of this Fed response to news shocks, as yeah, consistently with this earlier observation, are bigger on the FOMC subsample, while standard deviations of the information shocks are bigger on the non-FOMC subsample. These are the impacts of the shocks and variance decompositions. So we see that well, the first two shocks, they generate a negative, right? So a positive interest rate movement is associated with a negative response of stock prices, just as the theory asks. And in the case of information shock, we have a positive interest rate surprise associated with a positive interest rate, with a positive stock price movement, again, as predicted by the theory. So how do we know that the first shock is a monetary policy shock and the second is the Fed response to news shock? Well, the first shock, looking at the variance decomposition, is mainly accounting for the residual, and the second shock is mainly accounting for the fitted values of the from the Bowers-Watson regressions. So so we've identified the shocks, then we put them in a VER, in a standard macro VER, and estimate the impulse responses. And what you see, and that's the key result of the paper, we have the effects of the three shocks we've just identified. So in the left column, you see a monetary policy shock. So this is a GS1 is a 1-year treasury yield, and it's measured here over 3 years, right? So the first monetary policy shock is an interest rate increase associated with a decline in stock prices, increase in the excess bond premium, gradual decline in GDP, and in GDP deflator. Looking at the right-hand side column, central bank information shock is an interest rate hike, but that's associated with an increase in stock prices, decline in the excess bond premium, and then a gradual increase in GDP, and yeah, not much of a significant effect on GDP deflator. Right, and the middle shock is kind of similar to, so it also it's an interest rate hike associated, if anything, with a stronger economy, because that's also endogenous, that also captures endogenous policy. It is empirically weaker. So since I think I'm running out of time, I will skip over the next 2 slides and conclude. So we exploit sign and magnitude restrictions and heteroscedasticity between FOMC and non-FOMC events to disentangle monetary policy, Fed response to news and CBI shocks. We find monetary policy shocks consistent with the theory. We find that empirically, information shocks are more empirically relevant than FRN shocks. And that's due, when we investigated, due to the fact that S&P 500 surprises, or stock price surprises, carry some additional information over and above what we only capture by looking at the interest rate surprises. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marek. Now we can start with the Q&A session. Let's start with Munseob paper. Dominic is asking, what do your results suggest that that Fed can do regarding the black and white income volatility gap? Can they close this gap? And if they did that, what are the aggregate consequences in terms of higher overall volatility? If you can go into a little bit more details about that.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So as we reported, so there is the fundamental and persistent gap in the real income volatility between the black and the white workers. I don't think that's something the Fed can address. But the importance, the relative importance, or the exposure to the business cycle fluctuation is fundamentally different between these two groups. So minimizing the fluctuation exposure and then the loss, over the business cycle, the central bank can put the higher weight on the black, especially in this context, the higher the income group facing, the higher the real income, the volatility. So it is not about the removing the gap in the real income volatility, but more about taking that into account and then doing the better job in terms of the smoothing the real income or the real consumption in our framework, the volatility. But still, how much the quantitatively how much it matters. I think we can do the back of envelope the calculation, but we have to take a stance on the size of the shock. So in the model, given specific the size of the shock, we can do some back of the envelope calculation, whether the monetary policy can minimize the substantial amount of the welfare loss in the case of the cost push shock, in the case of the recession.
So can I ask you as well whether you talked about what kind of policy would be the most appropriate for the framework that you have? Is this, we know that the Federal Reserve framework at the moment, it says that, that we have like flexible average inflation targeting approach there, and we have shortfalls approach there. So according to your analysis, did you have any insights about what kind of policy would be best for your framework?
Wow, yeah, that would be $1 million question. So the specific paper, I don't think, in my humble opinion, have an answer to that specific question. But I want to repeat the main message I conveyed at the end. So even though, we are hoping that probably the monetary policy can contribute to the reducing, or sometimes people say the eliminating the disparities across the certain the demographic groups. My humble opinion, not representing my co-author's opinion, is that we are asking too much to the monetary policy. So here I'm showing that simply targeting the black unemployment rate, it may not eliminate the racial disparities in the economic outcomes, because the black households are not the same group. We have to think about the heterogeneity within the black workers, within the black household, and then thinking about the aggregate and distributional consequences of the monetary policy. There is no simple tool, but those are the information we are putting on the table. So what would happen in the case of the more and more accommodative monetary policy? Who is gonna be gaining the most, and who is gonna be losing the most?
There was another question among the participants, which I will twist a little bit into. So they're asking about inflation expectations, whether you include inflation expectations in the estimates of your Phillips curve, and the wage Phillips curve. And they're noting that these expectations are different among the groups that you consider as well, and whether that would impact your results.
Yeah, that's really good question. So I was too quick introducing the Phillips curve. So in our framework with the two-period model, the Phillips curve that we derive does not include the forward expectation terms you can easily see from the multi-period carbon model. So in this case, the slope of the Phillips curve depends more on the persistence of the underlying shocks. So that's also the reason why we chose this specific instrument. So we have the detailed explanation in the paper. But let me think about this the race specific inflation expectation, because I haven't seen any paper credibly documenting that simple difference. So in my perspective, I might be missing some paper. Sorry about it if I'm doing it, but I think that could be the really interesting research, the project to push forward. In my humble opinion, the black household may have a higher inflation expectation because of their experience, because there are many papers showing that experience and history matters. But on the top of my head, I even don't know that simple fact, who is facing the higher or the lower, more volatile inflation expectation.
Yeah, so there is quite a bit of literature, right, that focus on the heterogeneity of inflation expectations across socio-demographic groups. And there is a big disparity across income, for example, which is part of your story. But there is also some disparity across racial groups. And as you alluded, there might be different baskets that they are consuming as well, the two. So, so there is some evidence that's black household, at least on average. I don't know when you condition on income, whether this will still hold, but on average, they do tend to experience higher inflation expectations. Okay, moving to Marek's paper. Marek, can I ask you, for example, could you further disentangle the differences in monetary policy perceptions? Because we know that the differences in monetary policy perception can have very different roots that potentially could differently impact the economy as well. For example, if the differences in R-star perceptions between the policymakers and the public, or the differences in the reaction function, that could potentially have some subtle differences in how one could expect that the shock propagates through the economy. Have you thought of further disentangling and whether this is possible, and whether you have enough of inference that would allow you to do so? Yeah.
Well, no, we haven't thought of that, right? So we are we're splitting so there are these few basis points surprises, right, around the announcement, and we're splitting them thinner and thinner. And actually, I'm surprised by your question, because we are typically
You're ready to go one step ahead. Yes, I understand that.
Yeah. So, and I don't know how to. Yeah, we would have to think more how to distinguish these different reasons for the disagreements. How to split them even further. But it's a good question. Maybe with 10 more years of data, we can do that.
Very good. Yeah, any other questions that we have for Marek or Munseob? If not, I think we can conclude this session, and I would like to thank all the participants for presenting and asking questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you
Thanks,
very
everybody.
much.